Hey guys, what is going on? It is me, BakuriBox12 here, and welcome back to another Realm of the Mad God video. As I'm sure you've already seen, the Lost Halls 2.0 update was released yesterday. For those who got to experience it on testing, you have a little more practice because it's pretty much identical to that. But before I dive into that, there is some additional information about the update, some new stuff that came out that I wasn't expecting. It appears that the Nidarian Reef boss is not out yet, at least not as far as I can tell, but from what I was able to play around with, it seems pretty close to being finished. There's also this new addition to the UI and HUD, where you can see the tier of all of the items that you have. I'm sure it's a helpful thing for a lot of people, but it makes my screen look a little too cluttery for my liking, so I've chosen to turn it off. What I'm excited to see though is that we have a new Horrific Sorcerer ST set. Clearly it's based off of the Horrific creation from the Mad Lab, but to my surprise, only half of the set drops from the Horrific creation. The other half drops from the Nightmare Colony in the Parasite Chambers. I think this is the first time that we've ever had different pieces of an ST set drop in completely different areas. The Abomination's Wrath wand gives you 225 to 265 damage, with the same range only at about half the rate of fire, so you could think of it kind of like a Doombow for wands, just not quite as powerful. The Grotesque Scepter has 3 targets with 935 damage on the initial target, so it's kind of like the Devastation Scepter from the Parasite Chambers, where you have all of this concentrated magic on just a few targets that does a lot of damage. But here the damage gets reduced by 135 for each subsequent target that you hit. So you're not doing 900 damage to all 3 of them, it gets weaker each time to balance it out, which I think is good. I've thought about applying the same thing to a Ninja Star in the future. Have it pass through targets, and then for each one it passes through, it gets weaker. I just really want the ninja to be awesome, so I'm always looking for ways to improve it. But it also has an effect on yourself, which I just noticed actually right now. You hex and stun yourself for 1 second. So in exchange for all of this power, essentially, if you want to spam your scepter, you won't be able to attack at the same time. It gives you 4 speed and costs 100 mana, which is actually a little bit higher for scepters. The Garment of the Beast gives you 10 defense, 50 mana, -5 dexterity, +8 attack, and +4 wisdom. So the higher stat of interest there is clearly the attack, but you are losing dexterity in exchange for it. The Horrific Claws accessory item is rather interesting. You get 40 health, 5 attack, 50 mana, 5 speed, -3 dexterity, so it's kind of all over the place. But I imagine the attack from the Garment and Horrific Claws combined with Abomination's Wrath would make for quite the powerful sorcerer. And if you're wearing the whole set, you get 15 defense, 3 attack, and 6 speed. Overall, it's a pretty solid set, actually. And I do like how half of the set drops in a different area, so you're not just grinding the same dungeon over and over. It seems like the wand and armor are the only things that drop from the Nightmare Colony. The Horrific Claws actually drop from the Crusher Abominations, so it's a different enemy entirely. But now let's move on to the main attraction, the Lost Halls rework known as Lost Halls 2.0. Unfortunately, I was not able to test out all of the bosses. Every single raid that I was in wanted to do a Cultist run, so that's primarily what I have footage of. Sort of as a general blanket statement, I will say that the Lost Halls is, while changed, largely the same in structure and how you go about it. Certain things have been simplified, things have been given more variety, bosses have been altered for the sake of being altered, really, but overall this is still the Lost Halls. I will say that I enjoyed this version of it a lot more than the first one. The biggest complaint about the Lost Halls was getting to the bosses. You go through the same looking rooms over and over. Even though the Lost Halls Discord was able to run them in about 20 minutes or so, the monotony of doing the same thing over and over gets to you after a while. And unfortunately, that same concept is here because, well, you're still going through the same rooms over and over. But the monotony has been drastically reduced because more enemies have been added, they have more unique and distinct patterns, and everything feels more balanced out. You can move and breathe and really feel like you're playing a part in a group. It is still very much a raid dungeon, but it's far more balanced and feels more like a team dungeon. Before I get into that though, I was unaware that they also changed the Lost Century event boss that drops the Lost Halls. I had always loved this event. I didn't think it was in need of changing. I thought it was difficult, fair, pretty scary at times, and very large in scale. That being said, the changes that they've made to it I think are pretty solid. What I had always liked about the original fight was how much was going on screen without it being too fast or too chaotic to read. The only thing that really made the fight super scary and Nexus worthy was the Spectral Sentry, Spooky Boy, running around the perimeter of the room and really catching you off guard. Well, a few things have been changed. From what I can tell, the Lost Sentry doesn't take nearly as long to kill. That could just be be me. There are also a couple of new phases to watch out for. One where he shoots out a bunch of green and blue shots in this fan shape, but the one that I still have a lot of trouble with is this weird arcing fireball attack. The Spectral Sentry has also had his speed reduced, thankfully. That was the one thing that felt a little bit like overkill the first time. Gods can still walk through the walls, which is weird, but whatever, I guess. Now let's take a closer look at the halls themselves. HP scaling and base HP adjustments have been made, so that way depending on your group size, it's still manageable, which I think was very necessary. As observed before, the rooms are now much bigger, hallways are wider, there are less rooms to go through in total, and there are more enemy types, with more varied attack patterns to add to the overall variety and make it feel less stagnant. What I really like about the halls now, though, are the little touches that have been added, like the marble pillars that you see throughout. Some of these act as entry points for other rooms, like in the spawn and a few other areas. They can attack you, kind of like turrets in the Tomb of the Ancients, and some of them even have positive effects on whoever stand near them, which is very similar to an idea that I had a while ago in my 10 RotMG dungeon ideas video, where one of my ideas was to have statues present in the dungeon that players could hit or get near to receive some type of buff. It's loosely related, of course, but it's still nice to see that idea somewhat implemented. You now run into the Crusades and Oryx rooms way less commonly, although they are still there, and sometimes you will run into a lot of them in a row, but even if you do, Tricksters are a godsend here. Send a decoy in and the whole Crusade will flock to it. Huntresses are pretty good too for throwing a whole bunch of slows and affecting all of them, because as far as I can tell, nothing is immune to slow. The Commander is still just as dangerous as ever, but it's quite manageable with the right people. Paladins and Warriors are as useful as always, especially with the Marble Colossus and his potato phase. Knights are good because a lot of the enemies can surprisingly be stunned, and it is very helpful. Priests are always great for general healing. Ironically, classes like the Wizard are almost completely useless here because they don't have a party effect, there are no status effects. It's a class far too focused on selfish DPS that he really has no role in a raid-style dungeon. The rat and bat enemies now apparently have void blades, however they don't swarm and confuse you anymore. The slime rooms are new, where there is a giant green slime in the middle, shooting a clockwise pattern. You can circle it if you want, but chances are you'll stay back in the group and just fire from a distance and wait for the shots to despawn. The golem enemies are back as well, only now instead of resting in the middle of the room, it actually chases you with a very powerful attack. There's also a new mini-boss that guards the room to the Marble Colossus, which is really cool. He's like a wall guardian who sits on the far end of the room, but alongside him is this wall of arrows that fly out, and you have to carefully maneuver through the gaps to avoid all of the stunning arrows. One false move can easily send you into a ton of damage, and as the fight goes on, the pattern does get a little bit hard to read, but in a decent sized group, he doesn't have too much health, so it's not a long, grueling fight. Another change that I really like are all of the room hazards that are now present. Water, ice, pure evil, bombs that can fly out, these dark pits that look like torn holes in the ground. I don't know why, that really looks cool to me. Something about this dark, unknown abyss below you that you can't see or interact with is kind of cool and scary to me. The Agonized Titan treasure room boss is pretty simple. You still have to collect the 5 flames throughout the whole dungeon to activate him, and if you stand in the main hallway and just dodge left and right, it's actually a pretty easy fight. As a whole, the Lost Halls is far more dynamic this time around. The enemies are better, there's more of them. The rooms are bigger, there's more going on in them. There are more bosses, more attention to detail. The Spectral Sentry can still be found in the dungeon, and apparently he can teleport. Don't know why that horrifying change was needed, but Trickster decoys work on him too, so do that. The only downside to the dungeon is pretty much the same as before, just to a far lesser degree. You do feel like you're doing the same thing over and over after a while. I know after a few hours I was done. Like, the loot was good and all, and it was pretty cool, but I needed a break. And unfortunately, it still seems like it's not a very public-friendly place. I was able to get a Lost Halls publicly, and we could hardly even get past the first couple of rooms. People just didn't know what they were doing. But maybe I was just playing in the wrong place at the wrong time. From what I've seen of the Marble Colossus, you can actually solo it fairly well. Not saying it's easy or that you can even do it without a pet, but I saw Hofster do it over on the Mothership's channel, and it looks pretty cool. Void, from what I've told, is just as insane as before, only harder or easy. I actually don't know if it's more difficult or not. All I know is that people say it's not worth it to do right now. Generally, your loot is going to consist of life or mana, but unlike the Cultist hideout, where I'm pretty sure you're guaranteed a life, you can get 2 mana from Void, which for most people isn't worth it. So they'd rather do a Cultist instead, which is easier and still has great whites, and get the life instead. And I can vouch for that. The Cultist hideout was really cool. The pathway to the boss is pretty linear and simple. The sorcerer-like enemies have so many different crazy debuffs and shot patterns going around, but in a decent group it still feels like the Lost Halls, very raid-like, going in a straight line, piling on the damage as much as you can, throwing out your abilities against these crazy powerful monsters, and then you make it to the end where you have actually a pretty stunning boss fight. I had never done the original Cultist fight back whenever Lost Halls had just come out. I was already kind of checked out at that point, but I gotta say, I really like it. When you see what happens on screen, the attacks are fast and powerful, but it never feels unfair. It's shockingly well controlled. You have 5 different sorcerers that have 5 different attacks with 5 different status effects. Typically you want to go after red and yellow first, and especially yellow for the paralyze, and when you see the attacks that they throw out, it looks insane, but as long as you keep on moving and track their movements by keeping an eye on them, it's not too bad. I really like watching the colored patterns that they throw out. I noticed that sticking to the bottom left was a common placement for a lot of us. That's sort of the mutual group up point for each phase. They'll summon big creatures in the middle of the room. Smaller minions may surround the bigger part of the room. Once you've defeated all 5 of them again, the red one will take control by combining all of the elements, then fire all of the attacks out and move around the room, and then return to the middle for one last hurrah, and then you usually get 2 life and a mana from that. You can get the vial for a void run, and of course that delicious necro set that I would love to get my hands on at some point. I think Cultist is one of the best parts of the dungeon. It's definitely, as a lot of people have pointed out, the most profitable aspect of it. Again, haven't been able to do Marble or Void, so I can't speak for the update in its entirety, but I think this is a really solid job. I'd say it's best experienced in a Lost Halls raid Discord. I think compared to what we had before, this is a brilliant step in the right direction. Not necessarily my new favorite dungeon by any means, but better than what we had, and that's what matters most. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope that you're enjoying the new updates so far. And as always, don't forget to check out the next episode whenever I post it, which will probably be soon. Alright? See ya.